Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon as we launch two books for the Liu Institute Series in Chinese Christianities with the University of Notre Dame Press. My name is Michelle Hawks, and I'm the founding director of the Liu Institute for Asian Studies at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. The Liu Institute's mission is to educate about Asia and its diaspora through a multitude of disciplines and research initiatives. With this mission in mind, we at the Liu Institute were thrilled when Notre Dame Press approached us in 2020 to propose what has now become the Liu Institute Series in Chinese Christianities. This was particularly important to the Liu Institute because we had hosted several events that examined religion in Asia, especially Catholicism, through our history. So this series was the perfect program to elevate and broaden our efforts to support research about religion in Asia. And to partner with ND Press, the largest Catholic university press in the world, is of course outstanding. Speaking of partners, we are honored that this launch is co-sponsored by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, our favorite sister institute here at the Keough School of Global Affairs, and by the Department of Theology in the School of Arts and Letters, our favorite sister department. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator and my valued colleague, Professor Xueying Wang. Professor Wang joined Notre Dame's Department of Theology in 2023, which was a homecoming because she earned her PhD here. Professor Wang studies Catholicism in China, paying special attention to the writings of Chinese Catholics, whose voices have traditionally been neglected. She has published articles on the work of Chinese Catholic intellectuals, including Yanwo, Zhang Xinyao, and Xia Daqiang, who offer divergent perspectives on how their Confucian heritage can be harmonized with their Catholic faith. She is the author of the forthcoming book, which we'll be launching for sure, right? Examining similarities and differences between Catholicism and Confucianism in 17th century China, the example of Zhang Xinyao. I'm sure you'll agree that Professor Wang is the ideal moderator for this event, so please join me in welcoming her now.
I think the difference in height is quite striking. Just this a little more. Okay, thank you so much for your kind words, Michelle. It's an honor to be part of today's launch for these two outstanding and exciting books. Sheets of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim by Justin K.H.C. and Translingual Catholics, Chinese Theologians Before Vatican II by Jin Lu. Both books represent groundbreaking research about Chinese Christianity. According to Jonathan Tian, C's ethnography and critical analysis not only document the deep complexities and nuances in how the framework of Chineseness and Chinese values is deployed as the backdrop in the cultural wars over questions of sexuality and marriage equality, but also unpack the complexities of the Chinese Protestant Christian diasporas in 3 Pacific Rim cities and the roles they play in shaping the debates over global and trans-Pacific versus North American values and norms. And if I may also cite Benoit Vermander, author of The Encounter of Chinese and Western Philosophies. So this is a comment about Professor Lu's book. Rather than confining Chinese Catholicism to its linguistic world and internal issues, Jin Lu considers Chinese Catholic intellectuals as polyglot actors inserted into the ethical change that Catholicism has experienced during the 20th century. Such a shift of perspective makes this work significant from the start. Now I'd like to briefly introduce each author. Justin C. is Assistant Professor of Religion and Culture at Singapore Management University in its College of Integrative Studies. His research interests include social and cultural geography, the Pacific Rim, Chinese diasporas, religion and secularization, and post-secular cities. Professor C earned his master's and PhD in geography at the University of British Columbia, where he also earned a bachelor's degree in history. Please welcome Professor C. Professor Jin Lu is a professor of French at Purdue University Northwest. She specializes in French Enlightenment, including Catholic Enlightenment, intellectual history, global religious studies, and translingual practice. Professor Lu earned her PhD in French literature from Boston College, advanced degrees from the Sorbonne University in Paris and Peking University, and a bachelor's in French literature from Peking University. Professor Lu is a friend of the Liu Institute. She participated in a 2018 panel discussion about the Catholic Church in China. In 2019 and 2020, she was a fellow of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, which is now the Institute for Ethics and the Common Good. Let's welcome Professor Lu back to Notre Dame. The format of today's program we will have each professor speak about their books, and then we'll open up Q&A. So now I invite Professor C to tell us about his book.
Actually, we'll have, because the slide deck is Jin's first.
Oh, okay.
So we'll have Jin go first.
All right, let's welcome Professor Lu to present her book first.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for hosting this event. Can everyone hear me? Mic working? To turn it on. Okay. Great. I haven't said anything important yet. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for hosting the event. And thank you, Professor Wang, for your introduction. Okay, right. I want to make sure I have this. I want to test this to see if it's moving forward. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Professor Wang, for your introduction. I truly appreciate this opportunity to meet you all and communicate with you about my book. There can be so many ways to present a book that is over 300 pages long and took me about 8 years to research and write. Remembering the time that it took me to write it is also an opportunity to acknowledge how much this book owes to the University of Notre Dame, the incredible team of the press, the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, which offered me a 1-year fellowship to work on the book. This photo was taken from the window of what used to be my office for a year in Flannel Hall. And see how I think it's such a stunning photo. So the view, looking at the Golden Dome every day, it nourished me as well as this book. Let me first explain my title. This book studies the life experiences and the theological writings of a group of Republican-era translingual Chinese Catholic intellectuals. The word translingual refers broadly to authors who write in more than one language, or at least in a language other than their primary one. Due to the French protectorate over Catholic missions in China after the Second Opium War, a significant number of Chinese Catholic figures had ties to the Francophone world and wrote important works in French. Being translingual allowed the Republican-era Chinese Catholic theologians to be inscribed in various intersecting global Catholic networks. My book focuses on the Jesuit enclave of Xueying in Shanghai, the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-André in Bruges, Belgium, the Jesuit theologates in Lyon-Fourvière, and the ecumenical circle Saint-Jean-Baptiste in Paris. It is through those intersecting global networks that the Republican-era Chinese Catholics participated in the elaboration of Catholic theology in the decades before Vatican II, which was held from 1962 to 1965, exactly 60 years ago. Vatican II was held at a time when Catholics in mainland China did not have any ways of knowing about it. Only by viewing Chinese Catholicism in its global context that it is then possible to honor the theological contribution made by Chinese Catholics in the decades before Vatican II. While Chinese Catholics did not appear to have played a prominent role at the Vatican II sessions, some of their multilingual members were part of the global movement that paved the way to the council. The term enculturation became widely known in the mid-1970s in missiological studies and the 1977 Synod documents. Let me borrow its definition by Pope John Paul II. Enculturation is the incarnation of the gospel in native cultures and also the introduction of those cultures into the life of the church. It is therefore not a one-way accommodation for specific cultures from an immutable theological center, but recognize the fact that local cultures in turn can enrich Christian theology. Enculturation is therefore necessarily a translingual process, which cannot happen without translingual contributors. Most of the time when people think about the relationship between Christianity and the local cultures, they think about how Christianity needs to adapt to local culture. This seems to be like a one-way accommodation. My emphasis is also on the second step, which is how local cultures can enrich the life of the church and its theology as well. The next point I would like to explain is the cover image. While it is true that we cannot judge a book by its cover, my book's cover is emblematic of my main arguments in its multiple layers. One, the interconnectedness of various global Catholic networks. Two, Chinese Catholic theologians' contribution to Catholic theology before Vatican II, especially in regard to the relationship between Catholicism and Chinese spiritual traditions. And three, the translingual context in which the Chinese theologians produced and circulated their texts. The cover image is created from Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy on a scroll featuring an excerpt from Zhuangzi, chapter 33, 天下篇, Under Heaven, Walk with the Creator, 与造物有. It was a gift from Chinese Catholics to Liu Institute, sent in celebration of his ordination on June 29, 1935. Liu Institute's ordination was a much anticipated and elaborate global Catholic event that mobilized various global Catholic networks. The then 94-year-old Ma Xiangbo called on all those who had friendly relations with Liu Zhenxiang to express their congratulations and send their gifts to Ma's residence in Shanghai's Tushanwan so that all gifts representing Chinese culture and fine arts could be packaged together to be sent to Belgium. Catholics and non-Catholics, while congratulating Liu for his ordination, expressed their understanding of his Catholic faith and virtue. Based on the Abbey's record that I show here, Chinese Catholics sent an 8-meter-long scroll of calligraphy with the inscription by Ma Xiangbo. This inscription situated Zhuangzi's thought in a Catholic interpretation, comparing the newly ordained Liu Zhenxiang with the mystic who walk with the Creator. Wang Changzhi, then a student at the Jesuit Theologate of Lyon Fourvière, was among the attendees of Liu Zhenxiang's ordinations in 1935 and could not have failed to notice such an impressive scroll with mass calligraphy, a gift offered in the name of Chinese Catholics. In December of the following year, Wang Changzhi left France to return to China. In his March 11, 1937 letter to Father Gaston Fessard, Wang talked about the early draft of an article on Zhuangzi's mysticism that he was working on. Wang Changzhi's article on Zhuangzi's mysticism was eventually published in 1941 in the Bulletin of Aurora University, a Jesuit university in Shanghai. Like Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy, Wang's article focused on chapter 33 of Zhuangzi, developing the idea that Ma had expressed in his calligraphy. Wang sent an off-print of the article to Henri de Lubac, signed on October 29, 1941, almost immediately upon the release of the volume. This text was thus inscribed in a global Catholic network connected by the circulation of journal publication and correspondence among theologians. It was the earliest text which interprets Zhuangzi from the perspective of Christian mysticism, especially Jesuit spirituality, in which Wang was deeply immersed. Using Ma Xiangbo's calligraphy on the book cover also serves to highlight his place as the father of modern Chinese Catholicism. Reading comparatively archival and printed materials in multiple languages, my book shows that many initiatives can be traced back to him. And in my chapter 1, which I don't have time to get into detail, I also have documents that prove that his priestly status upon his return to Xueying. That was a point that historian had been debating on, but could not settle. My book is not a collection of essays on various individual theologians, but rather endeavors to study them in their interconnectedness based on archival resources and printed primary as well as secondary materials in Chinese, English, and French. First, their relationships are intergenerational. They all declare themselves successors of the late Ming Chinese Catholics, such as Xu Guangqi. Relationships of affiliation and influence existed between Ma Xiangbo and Lu Zhenxiang, as between Lu Zhenxiang and Wu Jinxiong. As Wang Changzhi's student, Jin Lu faithfully preserved his teacher's memory and tirelessly promoted his merits. They were protagonists as well as writers of the history of Chinese Catholicism. They are also globally connected. This book is based on research that I conducted over the courses of several years in 7 different archives listed here. Within the steps of the Republican-era Chinese Catholic intellectuals necessitated visits to some archives that had become, for various historical reasons, short-staffed and therefore with uncertain access. My encounters with each one of them constitute a part of the backstory for this book, too long to be told here. Let me just share a guest blog post that I wrote for the website of University of Notre Dame Press, The Wonder of the Archives. Although I do not have the time to get into the details of the book, I would like to show you an overview of its chapters. You remind me how many minutes I have?
At least 5 more.
Okay, perfect. Then I can just, go over some of the chapters. Chapter 1 uncovers archival evidence that conclusively prove Ma Xiangbo's priestly status after his return to the Jesuit enclave in Xueying in 1897, and Lu Zhenxiang's role in ascertaining this recognition with the Vatican. In my book, I cited Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglione's letter to Lu Zhenxiang, as well as Secretary of State Montini, future Pope Paul VI, written to Lu Zhenxiang, confirming calling Ma Xiangbo Father Ma. And this chapter examines the historical moment that Ma and Yin ceased to directly appeal to the Pope in 1912, before revisiting the history of Christianity in China as a battleground for competing theologies and locating the life of Ma, Yin, and other Chinese Catholics in this history in relation to the Protestant story. And one thing I want to show in this chapter is how the history of Catholicism and Protestantism intertwined. Obviously, first we have Catholicism that was spread to China by missionaries. However, in 19th century, when the Protestant missionary went to China, they did not start everything from zero. Already there were some Catholic converts, and there are also parts of the Bible that was translated. So they get help from Chinese converts, Catholic converts. No one can learn another language from zero. That's my point. And also, when Protestantism had such a success from 19th to early 20th century, they became a model for Catholics such as Ma Xiangbo and Yin Lanzhi to emulate. So that my chapter show how those different confessions of Christianity intertwined. Chapter 2 tells the story of how Chinese Catholics strove to ground Chinese Catholicism in its own history and connected it to global Catholicism with the support of missionaries such as Vincent Leb and Antoine Godin. With Leb and Godin, Ma Xiangbo and Yin Lianzhi share the same goal of connecting China's Catholicism directly to Rome and freeing Chinese Catholicism from the control of European states, such as France. I think this part of the story is fairly well known, but what I also show is that when you read the documents comparatively across different languages, I also show that there is significant area of disagreement, especially in regard to the assessment of the first Jesuit mission. And basically, for Lab and Kota, the first Jesuit mission was a failure. And Lab thought that the Jesuit wanted to, their approach consists of trying to convert the emperor of the court, or for the lack of it, their protection. However, he overlooked other aspect of Ritchie's approach, which is how Ritchie rooted Catholicism in the Chinese language, without which a faith cannot make sense of itself to people who speak and who think in another language. So for Lab and Kota, what matters is they did not have a historical perspective. What mattered to them, which is also very valuable, is that Chinese Catholicism need to be directly connected to Rome. In that regard, they are allies with Ma Xiangbo and Yin Lianzhi, but they disagree on a fundamental level about the importance of rooting Chinese Catholicism in its own history, and also how to assess the first Jesuit mission. This chapter contains that the seeds of Benedict XV's apostolic letter, Maxime Elude, were already contained in Ma and Yin's 1912 letter to Pope Pius X. It traces the process by which, through a convergence of factors, Chinese Catholicism became connected with global Catholicism, enabling some of its brightest multilingual members to eventually have their voices heard in the decades before the Second Vatican Council. In the historical time when they lived, the only way for this to happen was for some people to be able to write in the language of the missionaries. One of Ma Xiangbo's wishes was to have Lu Zhenxiang serve as China's envoy to the Vatican, a wish that can be said to have been realized in an extraordinary way. Chapter 3 examines Lu Zhenxiang's role as a link between the Vatican and China before the establishment of official diplomatic relations in 1942, and the context in which his intellectual apostolate was inscribed between 1942 and 1949. It starts with a careful examination of the nature of the collaboration between Don Edouard Neutre and Lu Zhenxiang, which formed the foundation of what Lu Zhenxiang accomplished during his time in the Abbey of Saint-André. I wanted to make the point that as much as Chinese converts such as Xu Guangqi was important to Ricci, and Don Edouard Neutre was also important for Lu Zhenxiang. Every single one of Lu Zhenxiang's friends also knew Father Edouard Neutre. In every single letters he received, everyone always tell him, say greeting to Father Neutre, because everybody acknowledged that he was the one who took care of, oversaw a lot of things, a massive amount of correspondence. Lu and Neutre maintain a massive web connection with Catholics and non-Catholic Chinese residing in various parts of the world, as well as with various officials and notable Catholic figures worldwide. This network channeled the voice of some less known Chinese Catholics. One of the global events I narrate in the chapter is how Lu Zhenxiang adopted Wang Changzhi's suggestion when he prepared for the proposal to celebrate the tricentenary of Xu Guangqi's death and for Xu's beatification. Chapter 4 centers on the conversion narrative of Lu Zhenxiang and Wu Jinxiong by taking into consideration the rarely examined spiritual friendship. Basically, if you read this chapter, what matters is not just what they published, but also what happened under the surface and archival research and how people relate to each other, how the global Catholic network function that was at the background of what they published. And chapter 5 assesses Wang Changzhi's contribution to the thorny question of salvation of non-Christians in the context of his connection with the Jesuit school of Lyon Fourvière, especially his friendship with Henri de Lubac and Gaston Fessard, both the theologians that's very well known in the Catholic world. It analyzed the foundational works he published in French in the 1930s, which had never been taken seriously by scholars of Chinese Christianity. His two dissertations, La philosophie morale de Wang Yangming and Saint-Occident et les vertus des païens. Chapter 6 follows the conversion and the priestly vocation of François Huang Jiacheng, who was arguably the most well-known Chinese convert and priest in France before Vatican II, but he's much less well-known in the United States or in France, in China. Chapter 7 deals with Chinese Catholicism's mystic turn between the 1940 and 1960 by chronologically following the development of mystical ideas by Wang Changzhi, Lu Zhenxiang, Wu Jinxiong, and Jin Lu, situating each of them in the global epochal changes that Catholicism itself was experiencing during their lifetime, basically connecting what they did with the ressourcement movement in France, so where they had connections. That's my last slide. To wrap it up, let me borrow the concept of ressourcement to show the significance of the translingual theologian in this book. They belong to the ressourcement movement that paved the way to Vatican II. And at the same time, they form part of the sources to which Chinese Catholicism can return, not to duplicate what they had done, but to draw spiritual nourishment and theological insights as it continues to its development in the new global historical context. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu. Now let's welcome Professor C to tell us about his book.
So as I begin, I want to express my gratefulness to a number of people who have supported this project and made this launch happen. In 2018, the then acquisitions editor of University of Notre Dame Press, Stephen Little, said that what the press does is that it brings its authors to Notre Dame as family. Stephen has been brilliantly succeeded by Emily King, who saw this project through. And in getting here, I'm also grateful to Katie White, Michelle Seibert, and Steffi Marchman for their patience with me as we sorted through logistics. I'm excited to be here with my friend Jin Lu, with whom we've had many conversations at the Chinese Christianities unit at the American Academy of Religion. I'm thrilled that Xueying Wang is our discussant. Thanks also to Mia for getting us from the inn, and to Jen Marley for printing my remarks. The last thing that I want to say before I begin is that what I always wanted to say about publishing with Notre Dame and being here on campus. When I was a teenager studying at Moreau Catholic High School in Hayward, California, I was myself a Cantonese Protestant. I was very insistent on not becoming Catholic. And I thought of myself as having a lot of dialectical fun with my teachers. So like Notre Dame, Moreau Catholic is a congregation of Holy Cross school. By the time I went to work on this manuscript, I had become Greek Catholic in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. I'm not Ukrainian. And yet I was still writing about Cantonese Protestants. But for a press that had affinities with the same religious order as the school I went to growing up in the Bay Area. So when I signed the contract for the book, I was in Montreal. And so I went to St. Joseph's Oratory to pray at the tomb of St. Andre Bessette to give me words. As I am here now, I continue to pray to St. Andre for courage to talk about the book. He gave me strength to write. And I invoke his presence for the beautiful conversation I have faith that we will have about both my book and Jin's. So what I want to do today is to talk about the title of my book, Sheets of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim, and to reflect on what it contributes to the burgeoning field of Chinese Christianities. Sheets of Scattered Sand is my rogue translation of the Cantonese Yapun San Sa. Yapun San Sa was a term that I heard often during my field research in 2011 and 2012 among Cantonese-speaking Protestant Christians, which I shortened to Cantonese Protestants, in the Pacific Rim societies of the San Francisco Bay Area, Metro Vancouver, and Hong Kong. This term, Yapun San Sa, literally translated conjures the image of a container with grains of sand scattered in it. Those I spoke with in these societies referred to themselves with this word picture, Yapun San Sa. They had been portrayed in American, Canadian, and Hong Kong media as a new political bloc from the late 1980s to the time I was studying them in the early 2010s. Most of their politics revolved around opposing same-sex marriage and transgender rights, justifying the existence of their churches and social service work in zones and buildings that did not traditionally house religious groups, and joining political parties that seemed to the liberal press as moving toward the right. So when it came time to do my PhD in geography at the University of British Columbia, I decided to find out how Cantonese Protestants were in fact getting into local, metropolitan, and sometimes federal politics. I wanted to understand how they imagined the secular worlds they were getting into outside of their churches. I wanted to understand how they formed political networks and how they attempted to make their ideological visions into reality. So this book is a radical revision of the dissertation that I wrote at the time. As I say in the opening pages of the book, I still like the dissertation. It continues to be available on the UBC website. It's also 600 pages, and it would have been unpublishable for any publisher. It also had an argument that I felt strongly about in my 20s as a doctoral student, that I confess myself a bit more reticent about in my 30s as I stare mid-career in the face. My promotion to associate professor has recently been confirmed. Thank you. News as of Tuesday. In the dissertation, I argued that the 142 Cantonese Protestants I interviewed in the Bay Area, in Vancouver, and in Hong Kong, as well as the 13 focus groups I did and the audiovisual archive I also built, were secularizing themselves as they entered into secular politics. They were, as I argued then, rendering their Christian theological convictions private, while leveraging some form of Chinese culture to justify their political activities. So in the 10 years that have elapsed since I wrote that dissertation, there was a job market involved, there were classes to teach, there was a steep learning curve in the student to faculty jump. So it took 10 years, but I feel that the certainties of doctoral study have given way to the doubts of early career. So as I reflected on what the Cantonese Protestants I spoke to always said, they were actually communities that were given to a kind of infighting and ideological disunity. For every person who joined the Conservative Party or the Republican Party, there was someone else who thought that the church should remain neutral, or that a more radical democratic politics was in order, or that other people, whatever their political position, moral conviction, or biblical reading, were just too political or not political enough. It was in these contexts that I encountered the term "yapun sansa," which what I translate initially in the dissertation as a pot of scattered sand. I did not grasp its significance till I rewrote the doctoral work into this monograph, Sheets of Scattered Sand. So the pot of scattered sand, as it were, became a sheet because of my academic travels after I finished the dissertation. At the American Academy of Religion in 2016, I was presenting some work I was doing on the 2014 pro-democracy umbrella movement protest occupations in Hong Kong. When I said that those leaderless protests were yapun sansa, a scholar shouted from the back, a scholar who was not Chinese, which means that he really knows these words. A scholar shouted, "That's Sun Yat-sen." Sun Yat-sen, of course, could be argued to have been the greatest Cantonese Protestant of all time. He was a Cantonese man who lived in the early 20th century. He was himself Protestant Christian. He was also a revolutionary who transformed the Qing Empire into the modern nation state that we know as China. It was Sun's critics, I learned in my furious reading after this encounter, who used the term sheet of loose sand, yapin sansa, to describe Chinese people. His critics were criticizing Sun for trying to construct a nation out of people with no sense of peoplehood, whose loyalties were only to their clans, communities, and families. Sun, of course, felt that the term was ironic because if every Chinese person, as the term suggests, was doing their own thing, the one thing that no Chinese person ever needed to be taught was freedom. To be scattered is to be free already. But then I had a translation problem. Sun's term was literally a flat sheet, yapin, yipian, whereas my ethnographic respondents kept on saying yapun, a container, a pot, a tray, if you will. So because my book is not about Sun Yat-sen, it's rather about Cantonese Protestants who lived long after him in a very different context, I prioritize what they say about the container. But in the spirit of poetry, I remain agnostic as to the depth of this tray. That is why my translation of this colloquial term, yapun sansa, is a sheet of scattered sand. Now, there are two parts to this term, yapun sansa, a sheet of scattered sand. The first was what Cantonese Protestants were telling me, that they were prone to infighting and so on. So one focus group in Vancouver was asking my respondents about a local candidate for the school board who was campaigning on the platform of parents' rights, that parents should be able to decide on what their kids were learning in school, especially because the education system was moving toward curriculum that was anti-homophobic and affirming of whatever gender identity the students wanted to take on. One of the candidates in the slate was a Cantonese Protestant man named Charter Lau. His name really was Charter. And he seemed to have some prominence in the community. He was, for example, vice chair of a group named the Christian Social Concern Fellowship, which produced Sunday school curriculum on political issues for Cantonese Protestant churches in Vancouver. And so I asked my focus group members whether he represented them in the upcoming elections. The response I got was laughter. We did not push him out. We did not push him out, a middle-aged woman remarked in Cantonese. That was tantamount to saying that Charter Lau, and for that matter, the Social Concern Fellowship, did not represent Chinese Christians. Her husband agreed with her. He came out on his own. We have no means as a community to push him out. There were, in other words, no institutional mechanisms that Cantonese Protestant churches or other organizations could use to bolster Charter Lau's campaign. So lamenting this disorganization, this last participant then sat back inside. Truly, Chinese people are a sheet of scattered sand. But the scattered sands are only one part of the term. So a colleague sat me down when I was in the frustrated throes of revising this manuscript from dissertation to monograph. How, I was asking, does one say anything meaningful about a sheet of scattered sand? So my colleague graciously pointed out that there are two elements to this metaphor. For my research participants, the focus tended to be overtly on the incoherent scattering of sands that took the form of institutional splits, political disorganization, and uncontrollable action. But implicitly, there is also a sheet, and where the sands are scattered also matters. So mirroring this analogy, there is also a dual movement in this book. As I write about how Cantonese Protestants are frustrated about being scattered and often yearned at the time for a deeper sense of political unity, and that political unity you might say they got after 2012, after the time I was writing about with the advent of a new kind of Chinese cultural nationalism under the leadership of Xi Jinping. I also write about how they were responding to the sheet, the external container that I am claiming actually held them together. As they would have described it, it would have been the secular outside of their churches. But that secularity was itself in constant flux, embedded as it was in what I call in this book, the dream of the Pacific Rim. And so it is in that way that Sheets of Scattered Sand situates Cantonese Protestants in the time between 1989 and 2012 in the larger fantasy that I am calling the dream of the Pacific Rim. Its main scholarly contribution is to offer, through the prism of Cantonese Protestant communities, the beginnings of a theological reinterpretation of what used to be called the Pacific Rim. In this sense, the Pacific Rim operates as a powerful imaginary that powers civil societies that have vied for their place as political, economic, and cultural hubs connecting Asia and the Americas. The sheet that I am working on is not just the secular, the world that was outside of the churches of the Cantonese Protestants I spoke to. The secularity was particular to the formation of what was called at the time the Pacific Rim, which signals not just a geographical region that tries to integrate Asia Pacific, the Americas, and Australia and New Zealand, but also, and more importantly, a set of liberal imaginaries that at the time idealized multicultural civil societies and proffered a vague sense of democratic participation in places like Hong Kong, San Francisco, and Vancouver. There is, I must also stress, no single institutional entity that represents the Pacific Rim as a whole. It's better conceived, I suggest, as a dream, as a geographical imagination built on wishful thinking, as describing ideological content that circulated through civil societies and private institutions that claim to operate autonomously from one another. Where I see the dream of the Pacific Rim at work as the sheets on which the sands of the Cantonese Protestants I spoke to were scattered is in the way that the press, the law, and the government in the Bay Area, Vancouver, and Hong Kong imagined Cantonese Protestants. So to put it briefly, the Cantonese Protestants were not supposed to be acting the way they were. So as I close, a final story. In 2010, the New York Times sent an Asian American reporter, Jerry Shi, to cover the communities that they thought were involved in the federal lawsuit Perry versus Schwarzenegger, which challenged in the courts California's Proposition 8 and its ban on the use of marriage to describe same-sex unions. The problem, the pastor of the church that she interviewed told me, was that this church, while large and in the Silicon Valley, had not actually been involved in political action at all on one side or the other. He said that was a very courageous stand because Chinese Christians, he said, were criticizing them. The Times even ran a photo of a prayer meeting and said that it was about Proposition 8 when in fact it was their regular church prayer meeting. And yet while this pastor was clearly upset about his portrayal, the imagination of the Times was also of interest to me. Here were Cantonese Protestants, poster children of the economic migration since the 1980s from Hong Kong in search of political stability, especially after the 1989 Tiananmen Beijing Spring, and economic prosperity, and were therefore supposed to be secular subjects concerned only for their private profit. What surprised the Times, as well as the Globe and Mail and the Vancouver Sun in Canada, was that Cantonese Protestants also had something to say about religion, morality, and community values that exceeded the liberal imaginaries that they had of skilled migrants. The dream of the Pacific Rim, the sheet, on which the sands are scattered turns out to be secular in a register that may have resonances with the critical genealogies of secularization that in some ways began with texts published by the University of Notre Dame Press, like Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, but were also flavored by the liberal hegemonies that held sway in the Trans-Pacific region at the time. The Sheets of Scattered Sand thus addresses that dual movement, the scattering of the Cantonese Protestants on the secular dream of the Pacific Rim prior to 2012. In focusing on this transnational geography, what I also do is to decenter China as a national presence in Chinese Christianities. In fact, my translation of the title, Yapun Sansa, favors these Pacific Rim subjects over their national founders' original dictum, Yapin Sansa. In so doing, I hope that scholars of Chinese Christianities will find in this book new context, new sheets to consider when trying to corral the scattered sands that make up the various Chinese Christian communities that we study. And with that, my time is up. And I look forward to more conversation in this dual book launch.
So much, Professor C, and many thanks to you both for your presentation, your fascinating project. I have many questions and comments, but we would like to hear from you who are here with us first. So the floor is open for questions and comments.
Question for Professor Say, right?
Yeah.
Because very often that it's a Cantonese no one knows how to say my name.
Yeah.
The question for you is that so Hong Kong people are in Sansa, but the same old Cantonese but at the same time they've also built really dense society. So then how then do we reconcile the two phenomena?
Yeah. So I'm kind of playful with the metaphor, right? So there's the infighting that they complain about, but there's also the sheet, right? And the story that I tell in the book is that they recognize the sheet on which they are, right? And so so Bay Area Cantonese Protestants are going to be very different from Vancouver Cantonese Protestants, different from Hong Kong. In chapter 4, I tell the story of how Bay Area Cantonese Protestants often prioritized market integration, right? They recognized the Bay Area as a very economistic society, whereas in Vancouver, they prioritized trying to be legible as social service providers, because that's what it means to be part of Canadian multiculturalism. And in Hong Kong, it was about trying to express themselves as democratic participants in an undemocratic society, right? And so I think that the way, if we were to theorize out of these case studies, right, is that Cantonese Protestants or Cantonese people in general are very smart about the societies that they are in, right? And pursuing the politics of legibility allows them a coherence that they don't see while they're complaining about being a punsanza.
Any other questions? Michelle?
Professor Liu, I'm not an expert in your field, but I'm interested in translingual practices. And I was just wondering, in addition to what you've been telling us about practices that involve French and Chinese, could you tell us a little bit of how Latin comes into the equation there as well? I'm assuming the people you worked on were also conversant or at least could read Latin. Does that play a part in this practice?
Yes, the priests certainly are, especially when they have a doctorate in theology. They know Latin, but that was not the language that they communicate. They used to communicate with each other. And for instance, Ma Xiangbo, being a priest, he was conversant in Latin, but the language of communication, the material that I was able to see and read, it was either in Chinese or in French. And so basically, and scholars who study him because he wrote more abundantly in Chinese, tend to overlook the little thing, a few things that he wrote in French. He wrote to Antoine Godin in French. So yes, I think Latin is an important language, and however, and also the theologians, the worldwide Catholic figures that they work with also knew that it's Latin is in the background. It's the language that they did share in common. And also Wu Jinxiong knew he worked basically with English and French, and he might know a little bit of Latin, but not necessarily in a way that's as well as those who were priests did, I'd say. Yeah.
If I could follow up on Michelle's question, the Professor Liu is a translingual scholar, and I was very impressed by her adeptness in French, English, and Chinese. So given the translingual nature of your research, what were some challenges you encountered in accessing the very careful archival work that you did?
I would say the challenge first is to have access to them, because you really have to, for instance, some of the materials they are in private hands. They're not necessarily even in archives. So you really just need to follow try to trace their steps. That's one of the challenge. Another challenge, obviously, is the fact that of how abundant they are, the abundance of the material. Just to go through them. That's why my book, one of the reasons why my book took me so many years, is really first to sort of like you follow the trace, and one by one, then you gather the material, then to process them. And also some of those are in manuscripts. I grew up reading manuscripts, so that I think in a way facilitated my processing of the information. Yeah.
Thank you. Question? Yeah, please.
I have a question for both of you about what your Chinese Christians think about linguistic difference. So in the case of French Catholic Chinese intellectuals, do they think that there are certain thoughts that can only be expressed in French or can only be expressed in Chinese? Or if God favors one language or the other, you can only reach God in one language, right, or the other. And the same with the Cantonese Protestants, right? Do they see, I can only really talk about this if I use the English word for it, or the Mandarin word for it, or I really need to express this in Cantonese because that's how I could feel the presence of the Spirit in me, or whatever, however they're thinking about the way that language intersects with their religious projects.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think it is a thought-provoking question, and you can certainly quote different linguists, and you can also adhere to different theories. But I think those Chinese Catholics that I work with, they basically think that to be able to be Chinese and Catholic, you have to believe that Christianity is at the same time rooted in languages, but at the same time beyond the language. So it has to be. It's not just that is it translatable. It never has to be in a particular language, because from the very beginning, Christianity, when Jesus talked to his disciple, he was talking about Jewish scripture translingually. I hope I'm making sense in that regard. So that's fundamentally different from people who think that at the beginning, Christianity was in Hebrew. At the beginning, Christianity was in Greek. If you think in that kind of terms, you would always think that every time the Bible is translated, it's a compromise. You make copies, and then you make copy of the copies. It become less and less authentic. That's not how I think Catholicism should, post Vatican II, think about Christian faith. Did I think from my perspective, answer that question before I pass the mic to Justin?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the people in my church currently think that Ukrainian is a sacred language. But to answer your question about Cantonese Protestants, right? I think Cantonese now has become kind of a political language, like after 2014, after the umbrella movement and the rise of a kind of Hong Kong identity against Han nationalism and, Chinese cultural nationalism from the mainland. The time that my book talks about is before that, right? It ends at 2012, 2 years before the umbrella movement. And so at that time, Cantonese was a kind of language of convenience among, people who spoke Cantonese and who also wanted to learn languages like English and Mandarin to facilitate communication, right? And so, the people that I write about are not philosophers. They're engineers and doctors and biochemists and nuclear physicists, right? In the Bay Area, right? They're social service workers in Vancouver. These are not people who think deeply about language until things get very political all of a sudden, right? And so, so for them, I think that Cantonese was a language of convenience, but I also think that in some ways, more than the language, there's the folk stories, the martial arts stories that are communicated also in Cantonese that shaped what they understood as quat hei or yi hei, right? The sort of a sort of righteousness that and morality that they felt was lacking in the liberal public sphere, right? And so even more than language, there was a sort of ethic and an ethos that Cantonese sort of evoked.
Should I? Are you
Last
finished?
question, go ahead.
Last question. Okay. So this is for Justin.
Oh, yeah.
First, congratulations to both of you. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
If I heard you say, to be scattered is to be free.
That's what Sun Yat-sen said.
Is that what he said? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'm punting, but yes.
Okay. All right. Well, when I think of to be scattered, I also think to be scattered is to be lost.
Sure.
Can you
Yes.
deepen the contrast and why you go for one or the other?
Sure. So I gave a version of this talk at Singapore Management University, and my dean gave me feedback. He had heard my job talk, and he wanted to know what was different between this and the job talk. And he said that what he heard in this version was a yearning among people who were scattered to have some kind of political unity. And he says, well, that's what Xi Jinping offered them, isn't it? All right. And so there is a sort of lament when it comes to political disorganization. Cantonese Protestants who I spoke to felt that they would be more effective politically if they were more united. But then, there's what they tell me, and there's the yearning in that, and then there's how I write about it. Because this could have been a very deeply melancholic book. It could have just, been about the yearning. But I wanted to write about agency, right? I wanted to write about how Cantonese Protestants exercise their agency outside of their churches in a world that they saw as secular and in a world that was marked by the dream of the Pacific Rim. And as I sort of thought about that, it seemed to me that the Cantonese Protestant, what really made Cantonese Protestants upset was when they were misunderstood, say when they were doing things that were right of center or, even on the far right, they would be like, these liberals say that we're not participating in democracy or multiculturalism, when in fact they were exercising their democratic rights. And so there's an element of freedom to that, maybe a freedom that is not preferred by some people in some ideological circles, right? But there's a freedom to Cantonese Protestants to explore things in kind of radical democratic way, even if some people think that that the positions that they hold are problematic. All right, and so maybe that's one way to reconcile those two things, that they act freely while lamenting their scatteredness.
Yeah, lovely, thank you.
I'm afraid this is all the time we have. Thank you so much to our two esteemed authors, and thanks to all of you for coming.